So the subject we're talking about this afternoon, no, it's not this afternoon, is it? There we go, habits. At least they realise this morning. It's a continuation in the series, which I believe you've been having here, Our Problems, God's Solutions. And this time we're moving on to what is, again, a very timely subject, although one could argue it ever is, and that is war and conflict. So, of course, war is something. Is this working or is this throwing me off? Use the keyboard. War is something which is very much in the news, particularly this year. It's been a lot of the headlines, a lot of the front page news. It's been to do with the war in Ukraine, hasn't it? The escalation of the conflict, which has been rumbling on for a few years there, into an outblown special operation, which has affected the lives of millions of Ukrainians and has had knock-on effects throughout the world. And obviously, there's a direct effect of those. There's the soldiers who are fighting there, many of whom, obviously, in this conflict, 12 months ago would have considered themselves to be civilians. But it's ruined the local infrastructure, bridges, roads, schools, hospitals, and millions of people have to flee their home, haven't they, because of this? And it seems many people have, I think, been struck by how mindless the violence has been in this particular conflict. And it's left people with their homes in ruins, with nowhere to go, those who are fortunate enough to keep their lives. And I think we've all been struck by the brutality, haven't we, that's been displayed barefaced on the news media. And of course, it has knock-on effects, doesn't it, around the world? Obviously, we've got the refugees who have been spreading out from Ukraine, but also very much in the news is to do with how it's affecting the harvest and the distribution of grain, with Ukraine being a state which is a breadbasket for much of the world. And we can easily see how the war has affected that, in cases very directly, with shelling and fire and the like, but also just the normal operations of farmers trying to go about their normal lives to do an honest job has been disrupted, been killed or had to flee. And as we've been hearing recently, obviously, about the grain exports, that which can be harvested being impacted. And then with another spectre looms over us is also the threat of nuclear disaster, with allegedly forces using nuclear power stations as almost as hostages. And the international agencies which monitor such things being deeply concerned about the safety, with the impact of disasters potentially spreading across the world. Of course, that's not the only conflict, is it? It's the one that's most in the news and most of the headlines. The Syria conflict hasn't gone away. The suffering hasn't ended there. The conflict in Israel bubbling up again, as it ever is. Never really settles down fully. It's bubbling up again, and we could spend the rest of the afternoon, couldn't we, flicking through various war zones around the world, countless wars in Africa, parts of Asia, conflict all over. And obviously the news media tends to focus on what's new, doesn't it? And so the attention shifts to the newest war, but the old ones don't go away, do they? And what of the future? Conflict again. The spectre of increased tensions between Russia and China, particularly over the issue of Taiwan, or at least that's how it's being presented. And so there's a lot of conflict on people's minds, isn't there? There's a lot of conflict in people's lives. But of course, this is nothing new, is it? This isn't the first time we've been. This isn't a phenomenon of 2022, is it? Although it has been a bad year. Rewinding the clock, we can think of World War II, the very name of which indicates both its ongoing nature and its severity. The never again that happened again. Oops, that's the wrong way. That's the right way. Confused myself by having slides that move backwards. And before that, World War One, obviously, the Great War. War to end all wars, so it was thought. And the millions that suffered there. Going further back into paintings now, these are just a selection. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on history to have come up with necessarily the most important examples, but we can think of the Napoleonic Wars, the Wars of the Roses, which some people might still think are going on at certain places. The 100 Years' War, again with a rather intimidating title, and so on and so on as we go further and further back. Conflict, war. There's quite a delay there, isn't it? Ravaging across the world. And that is a selection, obviously. Again, you'll notice that we picked a kind of Anglo-centric selection of images there, or at least Eurocentric. Obviously, conflict throughout the world, age after age. It goes all the way back. We can trace this right the way back to the very beginning, when we read of a war which you could say encompassed 50% of the population of Earth, when Cain and Abel came to blows, right back at the beginning. And in the process of time, it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering to the Lord. Genesis 4 tells us. And Abel, he also brought of the firstling of his flock and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and his offering, but to Cain and his offering he had not respect. And Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. And the Lord said unto Cain, Why art thou wroth? Why is thy countenance fallen? If thou do well, shall thou not be accepted? And if thou do not well, sin lieth at the door. And unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. And Cain talked with Abel, his brother. Promising start. Of course, as we all know, it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and slew him. And so the seeds of conflict right there at the beginning. So it seems that it's a very deep-seated, doesn't it, issue within the human species, that we just really struggle to get along, it would seem, and come to blows so easily. I mean, certainly there was plenty of land to be had in that scenario, wasn't it? You couldn't make an argument that it was a crisis of overpopulation with just 4 so people on the earth, and yet they still came to blows. So where does this conflict come from? What's the source? Who's making us like this? Why keep starting these wars? Who's mixing things up, stirring things up? Well, the sad truth is it's us. Scripture tells us there's no one to lay the blame on. From whence come wars and fightings among you? Asks James in an epistle, albeit speaking about smaller scale disputes. But as we've seen, these things they're a fractal of each other. Small disputes turn into big disputes, don't they? Come they not hence, even of your lusts that war in your members? Ye lust and have not. Ye kill and desire to have, and cannot obtain. Ye fight and war, yet ye have not, because you ask not. Ye ask and receive not, because ye ask amiss, that you may consume it on your lusts. Greed, desire, wanting things that we shouldn't have, that others have got. Failing to obtain them, and it's seething within them. We can, if we rewind our mind just for a moment to Cain and Abel, like we say, there was no territorial dispute here, but still there was something that Cain wanted that Abel had, that he could not obtain because he went about it the wrong way. He wanted the approval of God. He was jealous, wasn't he? He was jealous of God's approval. And God said to him, didn't he? There's a choice. If you do well, then you'll be approved of. But he went about it the wrong way, didn't he? And he sought to destroy his brother in his jealousy. And it comes from these base motivations within man. First Epistle of John records, for all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, there's that word again, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life is not of the Father, but of the world, or of us. We might summarize those, I think, into, just to simplify it, into greed and pride. And we can see how, in the case of Cain and Abel, we can easily see that's very much a matter of pride. Maybe they're two sides of the same coins. Greed for approval, perhaps. And when we look at the wars around us, pluck a few, let's think of the Second World War, the Second World War. We can think of the pride of Hitler with the notion of superiority. We can think of the greed with a desire for the Lebensraum. We can think of those same things at play again in the Russian conflict, can't we? More territory, want to make a great name for himself. Many commentators have noted how Vladimir Putin has become increasingly obsessed with the image of historical great figures, Peter the Great, and how he wants to make a name for himself. It's that pride again, isn't it? It's the same things played out over and over. And so what is the source of this within us? Where is this coming from? Perhaps there's some evil spirit that is manipulating people, playing the world like a game of chess for his own satisfaction. That's one theory, isn't it? Which is convenient, isn't it? Because and we're just pawns, aren't we? We're just playing pieces when we get involved. It wasn't us. We were made to do it, following orders in a way. That defense again, isn't it? Very convenient. Unfortunately, again, Scripture lays the blame directly at our feet. Every man is tempted when he's drawn away of his own lust and enticed, gets carried away with his desires, doesn't stop them in their tracks. But those little ideas run into bigger ideas, and those grievances, they ratchet up into hatreds, and those small little things escalate as a seed. We can think again, going back to Cain and Abel. They could have resolved that so easily, couldn't they? But we're not told how much time elapsed between that event and Cain slaying Abel. And I would, entirely in speculation, suggest that I could imagine there being some passing of time, because that sort of hatred, it appears he didn't do it in an instant, in the moment. They talked in between. And one could imagine how that he would become brooding, perhaps, and that frustration would escalate. Again, speculation, but that's a pattern we often see, and fundamentally human nature doesn't change, does it? And so where does this come from? It comes again, just to hammer the point home, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? But that's a hard truth, isn't it? It's a hard truth. I think we'd like to believe, and it's popular to believe, that fundamentally, deep down inside, we're all good. That everybody wants to do the right thing, really. And that's the fundamental nature. If you just strip everything away, you'll find that people are good underneath. The prophet Jeremiah is relaying the words of God, is telling us about ourselves if we'd listen. The heart is deceitful, desperately wicked. And that's not the quote I meant to put in. 2 out of 3. I don't remember what the third one was, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't that. Sorry, there's a typo there. Anyway, I think we've made the point with the 2 that we had. So again, we come back though to the question of why. We've got to lay it down here, haven't we? We've seen, or a couple of layers, we've seen where do these wars and conflicts come from? They come from us. Where does that come from? It comes from our lusts, our desires, and where do they come from? They come from the heart. They come from our own nature. Where does that come from? Why are we like this? Why did God make us this way, to put it more bluntly? After all, the same Bible that's telling us that we're like this, that we've got this wicked heart within us, that we give way to temptation, and temptation comes from it. This is the same Bible that tells us that God created us. And so why did God make us this way? Well, we're going to come back to that quote from Cain and Abel. Why are we like this? We've been given choice, haven't we? We've not been made with the sole purpose of causing trouble. We've been made as creatures who are able to choose between what we should do and what we might want to do. It was right there, wasn't it, in that description of Cain and Abel. If you do well, Rather than paraphrase, let me see it. If thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted? You can choose to do well. And if you do not well, then that leads to sin. There's that fundamental choice available within us, isn't there? And so, okay, let's keep going back with this. Well, why make us like that? Why give us a choice? Why not just program us to always do the right thing? I think we can probably have a bit of a guess at that even before we turn up the passage, why that might be. God's created us intentionally. We're told, that he's made us, he's clearly chosen how to make us. He could make beings that just do everything he says, which he has done in the past with the angels. But he could also make beings that can choose. And why might you do that? Perhaps it's would you get more satisfaction, perhaps, if a friend gave you a gift? Would that mean more to you than if you ordered yourself a gift online and the postman dutifully delivered it? It's different, isn't it? One's just following orders, and the other one is doing it, especially if it's a spontaneous gift. They're doing something kind for you. And indeed, God is not an emotionless being. Very much the opposite. In the Psalms, we're told, the psalmist writes, the Lord takes pleasure in them that fear, in those that hope in his mercy. He likes it when people voluntarily give. I don't think I put the quote in because I thought it might be a bit tangential, but actually I think it does make sense in the context, where it tells us in the New Testament, the Lord loveth a cheerful giver. It's the same concept, isn't it? To do something willingly. And a robot or someone following orders is not a cheerful giver. They're not giving their obedience. They're following orders. And this all sounds very well. This makes sense so far, doesn't it? We can see it's nice. God takes pleasure in it. But why does he allow those choices to have the consequences they do? What about the suffering? We saw on those pictures, didn't we? Saw the children being carried across the broken bridge. And we think of all the people and the generations who are affected by those wars. It ripples down, doesn't it? And it spreads out. Even the people who never heard a shot fired in their life are affected, aren't they? Why let it play out? Well, there's a number of reasons. And one of them is the fact that God has not set up the earth in its present form to be the most pleasant experience for mankind. Because the current configuration of the earth and the things that are allowed to happen and the way things are a consequence of an action, of a decision, of a choice made back in Eden. We're all familiar with the general outline of the story. But perhaps most specifically, maybe it's useful to look at what the consequence was for Adam and Eve and mankind in general after having sinned and taken the fruit. And unto Adam he said, because thou hast hearkened to the voice of thy wife and hast eaten of the tree, in contrast to God's command, on a general objection to listening to one's wife, thou shalt not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it. The hard work of bringing in the harvest. Thorns and thistles shall it bring forth to thee. And thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return to the ground. For out of it wast thou taken. Dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. So it's intentionally a changed world. It's not meant to be so comfortable and easy as it originally was. That's one answer. Another answer, and this is hard to. I must admit, I feel it feels like on a tenuous ground to some extent to stand here, having not experienced the things that we're talking about personally, and to say, oh, character building. But I'm deferring to scriptures here, where the Epistle of James records, my brethren, count it all joy when you fall into divers temptations or various temptations or trials, knowing this, that the trying of your faith, the testing of your faith, worketh patience. But let patience have a perfect work, that you may be entire and wanting nothing. And so that act of hardship, or not that act, that circumstance of hardship actually can refine character, can knock off the edges, can bring out the best in people. And again, I appreciate it's easy to say this when you've not suffered, to say it's good for you. But what I can say from personal experience is people who I've met, I'm sure many of you have had this experience, who have been through some of these sort of experiences, often are incredibly nice people. They've often got, perhaps surprisingly, the people who've got least are often the ones most willing to help and to give. And perhaps those of us who live more comfortable lives, it encourages greed. Solomon, remarked, let me just have a peep. No, I didn't put it in. Solomon remarked about his desire that God would give him just enough, not too much, that he would forget God. He would have it so comfortable he would forget about God, but not so little that he would be caused to steal. And certainly through history, as recorded in Scripture, we often see, particularly in the book of Judges, there's a pattern that when things were going well, people forgot about God and their obligations to one another, and greed and corruption multiplied. And then when there was some hardship, people remembered what really mattered. For some reason, the next quote keeps disappearing off the bottom, which is an interesting one. But it's a short one, so I can read it if I'm quick. It says, though he were a son, yet learned he obedience. Oh, self in a pickle now. Oh, it's gone. I remember the last line now. Though he were a son. I don't know why it's not showing up. Essentially, yet learned he obedience through his suffering. He's talking of Christ. That the trials of his life actually helped him develop the character which enabled him to live the way he did. So it's all a bit hopeless sounding, isn't it? It seems like there's no way out. It's fundamental. It's who we are. And to some extent, God's chosen it to be this way in certain aspects. So it's all a bit hopeless, perhaps. Or is it? Maybe there is hope. For you may remember the nativity. Lots of people are familiar with these words. Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace and goodwill towards men. People associate it with Christmas, don't they? Well, what's the fundamental message there? Peace on earth and goodwill towards men. Peace. What's this peace of which we speak? It certainly didn't come 2,000 years ago. In fact, Christ remarked at the time, he said, if you think I've come to bring peace, you're mistaken. I've come to bring a sword, to bring further division in a way at that time. It's in the last days that there's hope. And that's a phrase from the prophet Micah, who writes, in the last days it shall come to pass, the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established in the top of the mountain, and it shall be exalted above the hills, and people shall flow to it. And many nations shall say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. Already very different sounding world, isn't it? Where there's a genuine worldwide interest in these things. For the law shall go forth out of Zion, or Jerusalem, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem, didn't need that clarification. And he shall judge among many people, and rebuke strong nations afar off, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares. There's a phrase we've heard before. Beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. They shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and none shall make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts have spoken it. So there'll be a righteous law coming out. There'll be a judge in the center who will reprimand nations as they need it. People will be content with what they've got, and none shall make them afraid. And this is coming from the mouth of the Lord of hosts. So a reversal of that curse. Because in that time, the period of necessity where the trials were needed to bring forth that enrichment of character will be fulfilled. That requirement will have passed. at least for a time. And so, is this peace in our time? Will we see this? Well, in a way, that's up to us. We can't change when it will happen, but we can change whether we'll be there, regardless of when it happens. James again writes, "Blessed is the man that endureth temptation or trial or suffering. But when he's tried, afterwards, at the end of all that, he shall receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to them that love him." And not just more life in this time of conflict, but in that future age. That time when the curse will be undone. And as it says elsewhere, that God will wipe away every tear. Things will be made right. So peace is on the table. Peace is coming to the city of peace, or Jerusalem, among all the places. The place which has had most conflict, and yet that will be the seat of peace, will fulfill its name in that time. And so we're not without hope. The world is not hopeless. It's hopeless for us to seek to resolve these things ourselves, but we're not going to be left to resolve them ourselves. And the Lord will judge out of Zion and take away that war and that suffering, all in good time. And if you continue to visit us here, we can speak in more detail, as we have done on previous weeks, about the path to get there and to participate in that and all the things that need to take place. But for now, thank you for your attention, and I hope to see you next week.